Still waiting for everybody else to file in. And while we're doing so, I just hope everybody was able to see that the recordings are now being posted. This one will be posted on probably Monday, so once we get everything processed and branding sorted out. This is the fifth one, so we're halfway through. We have 5 more sections after this, and once we near the end of the series, we'll be taking suggestions if you guys think there's anything more that you want to see from the series, anything that you want to see from Sean and I. If you have any more questions, things that you want to see delved into more deeply, we can discuss having more targeted sessions on certain things. So today's session is on automating asset management workflows for preventative maintenance and inspections. I know preventative maintenance is top of mind for most facilities managers. It helps lower your expenses for facilities repairs and everything. So if there's no questions before we get started, I will give the floor to you, Sean, and you can take it away.
Thanks, Ian. So this is Sean Benson, and as Ian said, this is the 5th in the knowledge series we've covered so far, communicating with the service desk application, looking at asset management or a framework for asset management. We discussed Revit and synchronizing Revit models into Archibus, and today's session is a continuation of asset management in general. We call this one automating asset management workflows, but really it's going to be using and focusing on setting up the preventive maintenance application, because really that's where you can set up your regular scheduled procedures and jobs. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll talk a little bit about opportunity that we see in many of our customers, and then I'm going to focus right in on the steps that it requires to get preventive maintenance set up for these different routines. So let's start with opportunity. I think a lot of our customers, they spend a lot of time fighting fires. So you ask them, what are they doing? And they're basically spending a lot of time working on what comes in today. And when they ask me about setting up, workflows or maintenance workflows, reactive maintenance workflows, they always ask about, how do I set up a high priority or an emergency type procedure? And that's because a lot of what they're doing is responding to things as they occur. And the idea, I think, in most facilities departments is to reduce that amount of firefighting and try to justify and control, what you're actually doing, how you're spending your time, and so on. And so in Archibus, what we tend to offer is the ability to prioritize and track any kind of regular work so that you don't have to spend a lot of your time reacting to things that come up. And this means that you want to try to also increase predictability of your work and your jobs. So a lot of our customers spend 60 or 80 or even 100% of their time reacting to work that comes in day to day, rather than planning on it and organizing yourselves around, predefined schedules, predefined work. And most of the customers, they don't want to be doing that. They don't want to be firefighting all day long. What they'd like to do is take that 100%, 80, 60% of reactive work and turn that into predictive or preventive work, so that the reactive slowly reduces down to 20 or 40% of the overall work that you do. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get rid of reactive if you're trying to satisfy your customers, but if you're looking to, be able to control and justify your spending, you need to get to a point where a lot of what you do is expected, it's planned, it's built into the budget, and only the 20% left over is what's kind of day-to-day reactive. And I like this picture on the screen because it kind of shows a fireman who's got fires going on, and he's got fires he has to maintain, but he's in some kind of control of those fires. This is a planned fire. He's ready for it, and he's organized around it, so that although it's something that he has to do and has to take care of, he's somewhat in control as much as possible. And that's kind of the goal, I think, of any facilities department. So what we're trying to do here, and what I'm talking about, is not just preventive equipment maintenance, but using Archibus preventive maintenance for tracking all of the work that you do during the course of the day. And this is important to know where you're spending your time, but also to help you predict all of the types of jobs that you're doing, not just equipment maintenance, but all of the types of things that facilities managers are responsible for. I went into a customer the other day recently, and I said, how do you spend your time? And they told me how much time they spent doing inspections and regular maintenance. And I figured out, I did some math, and I kind of figured out that they work about 4 hours a day, right? Now they're getting paid for 8 hours of work. And I kind of said to them at that point, I said, wait a second, what you just described is 4 hours a day of work. Where's the other 4 hours happening? And they said, oh, well, we get lots of, kind of questions and answers, and we do a lot of consulting with our clients about, what they can do and so on. And I said, well, how are you managing or tracking that? And they said, well, we're not. We do that all with messaging, with emails, with phone calls, and so on. So I said, look, no matter what you're doing, somehow you've got to be able to manage it. You've got to be able to track it so that you can later on report and say, I'm doing this particular job. And Archibus preventive maintenance and also reactive maintenance together can help you track all of the work you do, whether it's something that comes up or something that you can plan and do on a regular basis. So preventive maintenance, although it's called preventive maintenance or PPM, actually it can be used for planned equipment maintenance, which is a kind of typical use of it, but also for housekeeping, cleaning procedures, pest control, spraying, painting, you name it, inspections and regular checklists of things that have to get done on a regular basis, and even one-time or regular drills and events. So for example, you might not kind of think about it, but fire drills might be something that you want to plan using preventive maintenance application to schedule a ticket, to say that you're spending time on it, to track your time against it, and to close something out when it's done. Annual office parties are kind of useful because you can throw up a procedure for an annual Christmas party, and you can generate multiple tickets for different teams to organize the party. So these are not typical examples of what you might use, but because all of you do a variety of different types of work in facilities management, it does help to think about using preventive maintenance in a variety of ways. And the reason why is because the preventive maintenance application allows for a lot of things related to labor and cost estimation, workload balancing, and also verification of contracts. So a lot of your work is done because you have to do it based on a contract or a regulation. And if you have to do something, you should be able to prove at the end of the month, or at the end of the quarter, or at the end of the year that you've met that obligation. So this is one of the key things and key reasons for tracking. So in terms of Archibus, how do you use the preventive maintenance application to do all of these things? Well, I've got two sets of steps here that we're going to talk about. One are the required steps for the application for being able to define scheduled jobs and generate work orders for them. And the 5 steps are, obviously a starting point is to do analysis of the overall work that you have and obligations you have, which includes you're looking at your contractual requirements, your daily, weekly, and monthly workloads versus the resources you have. But as you get into the software, there's only about 5 steps, right? One is to define all of the regular jobs that you do, or procedures, we call them in Archibus, which ultimately will generate work orders and labor estimates. Step 2 is to assign those procedures to all the locations or physical objects, typically equipment, that you're going to maintain or assign work to. Step 3 is to identify for each object type or procedure how often you're going to do it and when it's going to start. And then in the background, once work orders are generated, you need to have service level agreements set up to define the workflow for each of those jobs. So if a plumbing procedure is generated, you have to have a service level agreement set up to assign the work order to the plumbing team. And all of the standard reactive maintenance requirements in Archibus will kind of get picked up at that point. So having work teams, having craftspeople set up, all those things that we do for reactive maintenance, they need to be done by the point at the point that the work order is generated for the job. And then lastly, of course, the step is to generate work orders and then go ahead and close and execute them and close them out like you would with any maintenance job in Archibus. There are as well some optional steps which will kind of help automate and help you report and justify that spending at the end of the year. So these are not things that you have to do to make the application run, but they're things that are suggested in order for you to get better use out of the application. So one is to define what we call PM schedule groups, which is a way of grouping different procedures together for the purpose of scheduling. Second is to define the work order generation rules. Third is to upload reference documents or manuals to your procedures so that the craftspeople or technicians can download them to their handheld devices or their work orders. Fourth is you can define checklists for more detailed task orders that you want to keep track of. And of course, you can also use what we call planned dates, where you generate the date prior to the work order so that you can start planning in advance without actually creating a ticket for a craftsperson. So these are all steps that we're going to talk about right now. But before I jump into that, I think these are a few recommendations I typically give customers that will help them kind of use Archibus when they go and set up all these procedures. Because, you know, in Archibus, going step by step and adding records is not necessarily something that's hard to do, but knowing which records or how to set up the records tends to be a little bit more complicated because you have to apply Archibus to your own unique environment. So one of the things I typically recommend, and it's based on some of the topics that we've already discussed when we discussed asset management earlier, is creating a naming convention so that you can filter and report on things in Archibus more easily than letting people kind of type in whatever they like. So for example, I always recommend that customers come up with an asset naming convention, right? We've talked about this in previous sessions where we might use HV as an identifier for all things HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, etc. So if you set up a naming convention where HV is the beginning of all things HVAC, then all your equipment standards, your equipment and so on, they all start with HV. You can very easily find those types of equipment. You can assign those types of equipment to teams and you can associate them with the right groups. So having done that, then using the preventive maintenance procedure becomes a little bit easier when you start having to filter on hundreds of thousands of equipment records. Secondly, assigning equipment standards to the procedures will also help filter the procedures when it comes time to assign them to equipment of that type. So for example, if you have an equipment standard called an HV pump chill, right, which would be a chiller pump, then only that procedure will be associated or available for chiller pumps. So that way you don't have to sort through all the different types of procedures every time you go to assign a pump to a new procedure. Thirdly, in naming conventions, is to make sure that you align your procedures with those same naming conventions, right? So if you have HV pump chillers as a type of equipment, and you have a procedure to check that equipment every quarter, then you might create a naming convention for the procedure called HV pump-12W, where W is week, and that would be 12 weeks would be a 3-month or quarterly procedure. You can use D, W, M, Q for whatever you'd like if you want to set up days, weeks, quarters, etc. But that kind of sticking to that kind of convention allows you to be able to look up things very quickly and consistently. And more importantly, when you have multiple groups, like for example, I often deal with health centers and hospitals, which are combinations of groups who may or may not use Archibus independently of each other. It helps that everyone follows the same convention. So if you all have the same pump chiller procedure, you don't have to, create 4 different procedures for 4 different locations. The procedure for pumps is going to be the same. So you just use that procedure for each location. And that way you save the number of records you're creating. So naming conventions is important for everybody to be able to utilize and understand. The other thing that I recommend is, how you create your task lists for each procedure. As you'll see, there's a description in each procedure for identifying what it is you're trying to do in the procedure. And oftentimes, especially for equipment, procedures are just groups of tasks that you have to follow. So there's a few different ways to create these tasks, and they can get quite complicated. So in order to keep things organized and simple, what I often recommend is that you use the procedure description for the outline or the basic task list, right? For those experienced technicians who just need reminders of what it is they're trying to do. But if you need anything more distinct, for example, you're requiring your technicians to follow certain steps, and you need to know that they've done that. For example, for regulatory, legal, or contractual task verification, then I suggest you use checklists or the inspection feature in Archibus, which you can set up and then force people to use so that they have to check off all the steps that they do as they do it. And then thirdly, if there's more detail than that, if there's a load of details, pages of description and tasks, for example, that come from the actual operating manual, then use reference documents to upload the actual manuals for each of the procedural tasks and the how-tos. And those manuals can be downloaded as part of the work order or even downloaded to your mobile device if you're using Archibus' mobile device. So that's, I think, something to think about as well. Because otherwise your description of the procedure can get complicated with thousands and thousands of characters and so on. Thirdly, when it comes to scheduling, one thing, you have to find some balance between scheduling 10,000 jobs at the beginning of a month or a quarter with not scheduling it enough to be able to assign people work throughout the quarter and make substitutes if someone's going on vacation and so on. So you're going to have to look at your workload, your balance of jobs that you do every day, and the jobs that you assign your workers, and think about how many work orders you want to generate in advance of each person's shift. So for example, a lot of people who are doing regular work every week, they'll simply generate just the work orders that they have for the next week. Others will generate just a month's worth of work orders so they can kind of schedule the month, plan around vacations and so on. But what happens is if you don't kind of think about how you're scheduling and you're generating too much work, you run into two different problems. One is that everyone has a queue with hundreds, sometimes thousands of records in the queue that are just sitting there until jobs are completed or until you get to the job. And second of all, you're putting more pressure on the process of generation sometimes, and you're waiting longer for the actual system to generate, thousands or 10,000 work orders in an evening or something. And if the system, fails at a particular job and you have to regenerate, you're again sitting around the office waiting for the system to run. So that's not as big a deal as it used to be. But still, I find that I'm surprised by how many customers I run into that have literally a 900 or 1,000 open tickets in their queue because they've kind of generated too far in advance. So think about these things, three things: naming conventions, task list definition, and scheduling in order to keep your system as simple as possible. Okay, I've done enough talking at this point. Let's hop right into the application, and I will go through these tasks again. So step one for defining scheduled jobs is analysis. That really has to do, that's something that you do prior to working in Archibus. You have to gather all your contracts, all your requirements, that list of equipment that you have or list of locations, and try to figure out how much work you want to assign on each month and each week and so on. So you start with that, but then we get into the main steps of defining procedures, assigning procedures, and defining schedules. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to log into Archibus here. And to set up any regularly scheduled job, the first thing you do as you go into the preventive maintenance application, and as the maintenance manager, you define procedures, steps, and resources. So you go to this task here, define procedures, and you click on it. And when you get to that task, you'll see this maybe a few examples of these, but basically what you do is you identify a new procedure by pressing add new. You add the procedure, you select the procedure. So for example, if I wanted to do that HV pump I was talking about earlier, we'd type in HV pump and we'd say it's a 03 month, whatever that is. Now you'll notice I've run into there's a default length, field length, so that may not work. Maybe I do 3M for a 3-month procedure, and then I give that as description, etc. Then that's all you really need to do, because by default this procedure type will be equipment. Now if this is not a mechanical equipment procedure, if this is anything else, housekeeping, inspections, or so on, you can actually assign this to a location rather than a specific type of equipment. So you do have to choose either equipment or location, but after this, and many of these things are informational fields. As I said, I do recommend that you choose a standard. So for example, if you have a pump standard set up, and I don't think I do, this is just an example, but if you have any of these pumps set up, then you can choose your primary standard and you save that. And from now, then in the next step, when I get to my procedure assignment, I'll be able to select this type of equipment and this pump chiller procedure will show up. So I press save. Now that's the starting point. Don't stop there, because the next step, which is to add a step to the procedure, is the requirement for generating a work order. So when you set up something like, for example, in this case, an HV pump chiller procedure, whatever that's going to be, you can't just stop there. You have to then go and add a step. And I don't know why Archibus chose to call this step, because in actuality, all you really have to do is call the step code 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, but create something here, right? So direction 1, okay? And I'm just gonna put some junk in here, 2, 3, 4. This would be the outline. This instructions and this step is actually going to generate the work order. If you don't have a step identified, the system will not generate the work orders at the end. So someone did all this work and set up for procedures and scheduling and everything, and they asked me, why isn't this not working? And we went and looked and we said, it's because you don't have a step. It's the step record that generates the work order. So what this means also is that you only need one step for one work order. Even though the procedure has, in real life, what we would call 5 or 6 steps, when you set up the Archibus preventive maintenance procedure, all you need is the one step code, because what that really means is work order code, okay, or work order number. So we want one work order, and that will generate a work order, obviously with its own number. And then in the instructions, you identify what you want in the description of the work order, typically the outline of the steps you're going to take, as I mentioned. I've even seen some people who are using paper. They'll do something like this with brackets to give the craftsperson someone, an actual checkbox to fill out when they actually print out the piece of paper that they're going to use. But otherwise, this is perfectly fine. And as long as you have that step, you'll be able to generate a work order. There's a couple examples here that you might see in the Archibus system in the demonstration environment where they have step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You don't do these. You don't do 11 or 12 different steps. That would generate 10 or 12 work orders for the same job. So unless you have 3 different teams, 3 different trades in particular, who have their own SLAs associated, and you want to generate 2 or 3 work orders for that job at the same time and have them go through different workflows to different teams, then you don't use more than one step. Okay, so I just want to highlight that you only need one step per procedure. Now, once you do that, I always also recommend that you create that step and then you add at least one trade. So there's an option for trade in everyone's system. And again, you should at least assign some trade for HVAC in this particular case, and you put in the hours that they need for this job, let's say 2 hours. That's going to allow you to start generating a 52-week workload for planning and reporting purposes. So this now in the Archibus PM Planner application will show up as 2 hours that you need to have every 3 months for these trades. So I always suggest these 3 things. Now, as you can see in later versions of Archibus, so the newer versions, 2022 and 2023, for those people who have them, you're also going to be able to apply checklists here. If you don't have that 2022 or 2023 version, and I can't remember which one it is, but if you don't have it, you can still assign checklists in earlier versions. You just have to do it as part of the SLA. Either way, whether you use the SLA or you use the procedure definition, if you want to use checklists, you can assign the checklist that you create here, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So checklists are something that you can now assign when you set up the procedure. In addition, you can also add to this a default trade type, part type, and tool type, and this is simply for estimations of cost and hours. So you can identify how many trade hours or parts you're going to need in the future and to help you order and everything else, but it's not going to determine exactly what trades or parts are going to be used on the work order, okay? So that's the first step in setting up procedures and equipment. So the second step there that's mandatory is assigning procedures to equipment. Once you have those procedures defined, you go through your equipment codes. In my case, we have this NBHV system. You select the equipment and you assign it to all the procedures that you need, meaning you check off the procedures you want to assign. And this is not all coordinated right now. I'm just grabbing something, but you choose for all the equipment that's associated with that procedure you set up, you choose the procedure and you simply add selected. And that will assign that equipment to the procedure and it highlights it. Be aware that if you have equipment or location-based procedures, they're on 2 different tabs and you can use the 2 different tabs to do the equipment assignment. That's a pretty simple step. Next, the third step is defining the schedule. So this is a little bit more complex in terms of what you have to do. But again, if you follow this kind of standard, HVAC, pump, and you work through it, which is going to be assigned to some team, then the next step is creating, for example, for all those pumps or all those HVAC equipments that you've selected, a starting schedule that you want to work with. So it might be by building, it might be by week, and so on. And what you do, oops, let me just click on this again so you don't have to look at the highlighting. What you have to do for either your location or your equipment-based procedures is decide on a starting date. What is the first date that you want to run this procedure? If it's usually the first of the month or the last of the month, or maybe the middle of the month, whatever it might be, select a starting date. And then what you want to focus on is the recurrence pattern, how often this is going to happen. Now, Archibus historically used to give people days, weeks, months, and quarters, but now in later versions of Archibus, they allow you to choose a recurrence pattern. So I recommend using recurrence pattern. And then you choose down below whether it's a daily job, a weekly job that happens on every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or if it's a monthly job that happens on the first, the last day, weekday, weekend, whatever schedule you want to create for that particular procedure. You set up here as a frequency, you make sure your starting date matches that exact frequency. So obviously if you choose the first day of the month, the first date should be the first day of a month as well. But once you do that, then you can fill out some of these other details. And I'm not going to go into all of the individual fields here, but basically, as long as you choose recurrence pattern, you select an end date, typically from an SLA rather than the schedule itself, just because this gives you a little bit more coordination with what you've set up for your workflows and your teams and the required reaction times. And then there is something called fixed or floating, which basically means fixed will mean that you want to generate this procedure on a regular basis every month on that same day that you chose. Floating is more used when you don't have a contractor or you have equipment that you're replacing parts for that you wouldn't want to replace too early. So what the system will do is it will generate a month or 3 months from the closure date of the work order rather than the generation date. So generally speaking, for priority procedures or important procedures or contracted procedures, you choose fixed. And then for things like filter replacements and other types of replacements, you might choose fixed. Okay, or excuse me, floating. But you set that up, set the date, and the last required step in this process is to actually generate the work orders. So you've got your procedure, you've got a description of it, you've assigned it to different equipment, and you've identified the dates that the work order should be generated. All that's next is you come in here and you generate up to 3 months in advance, but I like to do maybe 2 weeks at the most. If you need to, 1 month is fine. But you'd select that date range that you want to generate all the work orders for, and you press next and generate. And that is then going to look at all of the jobs that fall within the next 2 weeks to 4 weeks, and it will find out which ones will fall in that time and generate a work order for each one and pick up the SLA for those work orders and route it to the appropriate people on the time. So now we're basically generating work and automatically routing it, okay? The thing is, what we're not doing is we're not auto-generating, so I'll talk about that in just a minute. But basically, this job now generates a whole series of work orders that will end up in your queue. Okay, those are the required steps. Now, I also mentioned on this slide here some optional steps, and I don't think you should stop with just what's required. I think you should go ahead and look at some of these guys, which include defining PM schedule groups, defining generation rules, and uploading reference documents, and so on. So to do that, after you've done your basic setup, and after you've got the scheduling right, the workload right, the procedure assignment correct, then, and that might take even a month or two, then when you're ready, start thinking about a little bit more automation. So for example, one of the things you can do is have the system automatically generate these on its own. You don't have to come in here and click on the generate button. To do that, you just click on manage work order generation rules, and by at a minimum, you'll create at least a new rule for equipment and a new rule for location, which will basically do the generation for you. So if you set up a new rule for equipment and you left everything here blanked and just said, run this every single day, right, every 1 day, starting today, and you press save, then every night there's a little workflow rule in Archibus that kicks off at 12 a.m. and it will try to generate all of any work orders that are due for the next year or week or whatever it might be. So that's the most basic kind of rule you can set up, and that will automatically generate work orders for you, okay? So you can start with just those 2 rules, one for equipment, one for location. That may not be what you want to do, and maybe you want to have a little bit more control over what actually gets generated every night. Maybe you want to focus on what's generated week 1, week 2, week 3. So then what you can do, if you'd like, is to start creating something called a PM schedule group, where you group procedures together that are going to be run at the same time, and then you can use that group, as we have here, to coordinate when you're going to generate like all of your HVAC procedures or all of your electrical procedures or whatever it might be. So if you wanted to get into a little bit more detail and you want to have more control over how often and how many work orders are being generated each night or each month, then you can go into a little bit more detail. Now, a PM schedule group, to create those, you just go into that same maintenance manager menu and you click on define PM schedule groupings. And so here you can see I've created a grouping called air handling unit PM routine, and it's just simply it's just a record that has a group and a description name. You save it, and then what happens is for each of the schedules, you go in and assign those schedules to the appropriate group. So when you click on define PM schedules, which we did previously, there is a PM schedule group field here. You can assign that group to, let's say, the air handling units, and then you can choose to generate the air handling units procedures all together. So you'd go into as many procedures as you wanted to, assign them all to the same group, and you'd know that when you automatically generated them, let's say on a Saturday or something, they would all generate together as part of that group, and you can specify it. So that's kind of a nice way of kind of automating and breaking out the work that's being generated on a regular basis. So you might take that into account. The other thing you might want to do is, as we said, you might want to think about uploading reference documents and defining checklists for managing the more detailed tasks that your technicians have to deal with. And again, you can do those two things right from the maintenance menus. The define maintenance checklist happens up top, but if you wanted to just upload a document instead, you do have to go into the background data instead. And at the bottom of the background data maintenance menu is the reference document management option. So in here, again, there's a lot of different ways you can upload or assign documents, but for PM procedures, you go to Process, PM Procedure, select your procedure, and add a document that you want to upload. So here you would just give the document a name, save the record, let's see, and of course a description. So I'm just going to get that record saved. And once you do that, you can upload the actual reference document. And this document, once it's assigned to the procedure, every time the system generates a work order for that procedure, it will attach a version of that PDF or allow the craftsperson to download it to their mobile devices. So this is a useful kind of tool for getting documents associated with your work orders. And those documents, of course, will have all the tasks that you need. Now, if you wanted to also make sure that your technicians are going through and checking off each item and completing each required item, and you wanted to document that, that's where checklists come in. So if you haven't seen checklists, there's again a lot of information about this and a lot of instruction that we can give on it. But here's basically an example. You create a new checklist for whatever that procedure is going to be, or whatever procedure you want to associate with a checklist. And then you can go through this checklist tool, creation tool, and create a variety of different types of questions. So as you can see in Archibus, there are yes/no questions, pass/fail questions, single choice, multiple choice, text response, date responses, counts of items, measurements for, let's say, freezer temperature, for example. If you want to upload a document to the question, you can. And so you can even reuse questions that you've already used to generate these inspections. And you can have multiple inspections or checklists assigned to each work order or preventive maintenance procedure. So each work order. So it's a pretty useful tool if you want to force people to answer certain questions or check off certain items to say that yes, they have done what they were supposed to do as part of this procedure. So this will kind of force people to do that. And as you can see, a lot of their checklists are, let's see if I can go in and look at one here. The checklists themselves, when you edit them, you'll see that you can make them, where is it here? Oh, it's not here, but you can make each of the questions required. You can make the checklist required or not required. And you can make sure that people answer every single question, or they can skip questions. It depends on how you set it up. So there's a lot to these checklists if you want to kind of take advantage of them and use them. But we recommend these as optional steps as well if you want to take. Let's see. Lastly, there's one little procedure that people tend to kind of miss, and it can be useful. It has to do with being able to look in advance at what's coming due for procedures without actually generating the work orders. So there is a tool called define PM schedule dates by PM schedule, which basically will generate a date record where a work order will be generated in the future. And that date record will be able to be seen by the PM planner so that you can see when work orders are going to be generated, when you have work coming up. But it will allow you to look at that without actually generating the work and putting the work order in someone's queue. So if you will like that idea, think about using the generate schedule dates for selected schedules. I have to press show first, and then select the schedules you want and generate those dates. And again, you can generate date records up to 3 months in advance. And this is a nice planning tool because once you have the date, if you need to move dates around because of a special event, or you need to rearrange schedules because someone goes on vacation, then you can do that in advance so that when the system goes to generate that next date, instead of doing it on the first of the month or whatever it was that was scheduled, it will use the new date record that you've modified. So this is useful if you want to slightly change things prior to generating the work orders. And all of that comes together on the for the PM Planner on the PM Planner screen, which is in use in current versions of Archibus, where you'll be able to actually look at all of the procedures that you have coming due, and for each procedure, all of the equipment or buildings associated with that procedure. And you can look on that planner and see 52 weeks in advance the work that's coming due, the dates that are coming due, work that's been finished or completed on time versus work that was not on time. And you can actually see the differences between jobs that have been generated or just jobs that have been planned. And you can actually use the screen to make modifications and basically balance out your workloads. And there's quite a few different options for the screen. So you can actually look at projected costs of the work that you've planned, projected labor hours that you've got planned for both preventive and your average on demand. And it will tell you whether you've got any remaining available hours or whether you're over the amount of hours that you have. Now I'm a little bit over schedule here. We've only got about 8 minutes left, and this is a quickie introduction to preventive maintenance setup and the automation of regularly scheduled routines. But we hope that this will get you started on, and also explain that there aren't too many steps involved in getting you up and running with Archibus preventive maintenance, and the benefits of that, which are helping you find a balance between that long-term planning and daily execution of both scheduled jobs and reactive jobs, and allow you to automatically generate tickets to record all of that work, whether you think it should be recorded or not, right? Because as we've talked about in previous sessions, the key is making sure that your management understands how much you do every day, not just the things that that you're being paid to do, but all the things that are required of you as a facility manager. So the preventive maintenance application is very useful for helping you identify what it is you do on a regular basis, track it, put a cost and a time associated with it, and then give you the ability of getting that flexible scheduling, getting a balanced workload, and also helping you justify, every year your contract and your budget as you go into the following year. So I hope this was useful for everybody. Again, we've got another 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions. So if you'd like, we're here to sit and listen. Please go ahead and ask questions in the chat or in the question panel, and Ian will pass those on to me. In the meantime, thank you very much. Next time, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about facilitating planning and justifying spend using Archibus's capital budgeting and capital projects applications. And with that, I think we can open up the floor to questions and answers.
Thank you, Sean. Like Sean said, there's a questions tab as well as a chat tab. Both of them I'll monitor for the next couple minutes to see if anybody has questions. Just some housekeeping while we're doing this. This recording will be sent out to everybody on Monday. Like I said, I know we're getting a lot of views on those. So if you want to, once we send that out, if you want to circulate that to your team for those who missed it, or you think someone who will find value in these recordings, then definitely do so. I know personally I've gone back and watched them to answer some questions that I've had come in from clients, and it's been very helpful. I'm not seeing any questions coming up, and I know we do only have 5 minutes left. So in that case, if one last call for questions. If not, thank you everybody for attending. I will be sending the invite for the next session on facilitating planning and justifying spend for capital budgeting. Will go out next week, and we can hope to see everybody there.